The emergence of Alex Mercer in the morgue of Gentek introduces the lore of the biological resurrection of the apex. This is the moment where the individual dies and the virus begins to wear the skin, representing the anatomical sovereignty of the Blacklight. The lore suggests that Alex is not a man with powers, but a sentient infection that has consumed the memory of the host. For Mercer, this awakening is the lore of the cognitive amnesia of the monster. He wakes up in a cold room, but his blood is a weaponized colony, representing the industrialization of the genetic terror. This is the lore of the molecular cannibalism, where the protagonist must eat the city to remember the past. It proves that the Gentek research has turned identity into a biological resource, turning the streets of Manhattan into a sacrament of the predator. The encounter with Blackwatch and General Randall provides the lore of the militarized sanitization of the outbreak. Blackwatch, a shadow agency dedicated to containing the uncontainable, represents the ethical bankruptcy of the national security. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the scorched earth. They do not save the civilians. They manage the infection rate, representing the strategic sovereignty of the general. This is the lore of the administrative massacre. It suggests that the government is the only entity more viral than the Mercer, turning the civil liberties into a variable of the containment. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the state. The lore of the Blackwatch strike team is the lore of the Iron Wall. You must shred the steel to find the truth, proving that your sovereignty is unstoppable. This highlights the conflict of the monsters, turning the urban warfare into a sacrament of the attrition. The lore of the consumption and the web of intrigue provides the lore of the psychic archaeology of the flesh. By consuming the targets, Mercer gains their memories and physical forms, representing the invasive sovereignty of the memory. The lore suggests that the truth of the Blacklight project is scattered across the brains of the Manhattan. This is the lore of the neural theft. It suggests that the secret is stored in the blood. This represents the biological sovereignty of the archive. The lore of the web of intrigue is the lore of the mosaic of the sin. You must piece together the conspiracy from the screams of the victims, proving that your sovereignty is intellectual and brutal. This highlights the vampiric nature of the investigation, turning the Park Avenue combat into a sacrament of the revelation, where the hero becomes the casket of the city's secrets. The presence of the infected hives and the walkers introduces the lore of the ecological overwrite of the urban grid. As the virus spreads, the buildings begin to grow veins and pulsing organs, representing the biological sovereignty of the hive mind. The lore suggests that the city is being digested to build a new world. This is the lore of the architecture of the infestation. It suggests that Manhattan is a petri dish that has shattered. This represents the organic sovereignty of the Blacklight. The lore of the hive is the lore of the heart of the infection. You must destroy the spore nodes to starve the beast, proving that your sovereignty is predatory. This highlights the transformative nature of the plague, turning the skyline into a sacrament of the rebirth, where the glass and steel become bone and sinew. The encounter with Dana Mercer provides the lore of the residual humanity of the virus. Dana, Alex's sister and an investigative journalist, represents the moral compass of the abomination. Her lore is defined by the sovereignty of the familial bond. She is the only person who sees the man in the monster, representing the emotional sovereignty of the sibling. This is the lore of the ghostly connection. It suggests that memory is the only thing keeping the virus from becoming the storm. This represents the fragile sovereignty of the identity. The lore of Dana's safe house is the lore of the sanctuary of the truth. It reminds the Mercer that he is fighting for a name he no longer owns, proving that his sovereignty is haunted. This highlights the tragic nature of the protagonist, turning the mission briefing into a sacrament of the regret. The lore of the Elizabeth Green Subject 1 provides the lore of the matriarchal source of the apocalypse. Green, a woman held by the government since the 1960s, represents the primordial sovereignty of the outbreak. Her lore is defined by the mother of the monsters. She does not use the virus, She is the virus, representing the biological sovereignty of the Hope, Idaho incident. This is the lore of the ancestral infection. It suggests that Alex is just a child compared to her ancient hunger. This represents the goddess sovereignty of the Blacklight. The lore of the escape of green is the lore of the unleashing of the origin. It proves that the umbrella, or rather Gentek, has kept the devil in a cage for 40 years, turning the research facility into a sacrament of the blasphemy, where the mother returns to claim her children. For the Mercer of the Awakening era, the world is the testing of the apex predation. You realize that the world is fuel. The lore suggests that Alex is the error in the human blueprint. You are the only being that evolves in real time to meet the threat. The city is not a home, it is a hunting ground that you must consume with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the shape-shifting so violent. You are becoming the enemy to destroy the enemy. You look at your blade arm, knowing that it is the only law that the Blackwatch will obey. The Golden Age is a scream in the red light, and you are the only evolution left to shatter the chains of the Gentek. As this first segment of the history concludes, Mercer stands on the top of the Empire State Building, the city burning below him. Behind lies the morgue of the Gentek. Before stands the war for the Manhattan and the mystery of the Hope, Idaho. The air is no longer tense with the human life, but heavy with the smell of the viral ash. You have seen the biological resurrection, the militarized sanitization, and the web of the intrigue. The lore of Prototype has shifted from the confusion of the victim to the sovereignty of the apex. You realize that the virus is winning. You look at the claws on your hands, knowing that you are finally the end of the human race. The Golden Age is a blacklight horizon, and you are the only power left to rewrite the DNA of the world. The investigation into the Hope, Idaho incident and the recovery of the classified 1960s files introduces the lore of the prehistoric shadow of the Blacklight. This is the revelation that the modern plague is actually an ancient echo, representing the ancestral sovereignty of the red light. The lore suggests that in 1968, the town of Hope was not a victim of an outbreak, but a government testing range for a variant of the virus designed to target specific ethnic markers, representing the eugenic sovereignty of the Blackwatch. For Mercer, this history is the lore of the genetic paternity of the sin. He finds that his creation was paid for by the extinction of a town. This is the lore of the ghost of the Great Plains, where the government turned a community into a sacrament of the bioweaponry. It proves that the Gentek sin was a sequel to a sovereign massacre, turning the military archives into a casket of the national shame. The origins of the red light virus provide the lore of the deviant evolution of the DNA. Unlike the Mercer Blacklight strain, which is smart and mimetic, the original red light was brutal and maternal, representing the feminine sovereignty of the infection. The lore suggests that Elizabeth Green was the only survivor of the Hope experiment because the virus accepted her as its queen, representing the symbiotic sovereignty of the subject one. This is the lore of the Red Mother. It suggests that evolution does not always lead to complexity, but sometimes to a pure, unfiltered hunger. This represents the primordial sovereignty of the red light. The lore of the viral strains is the lore of the war of the fluids. It proves that Mercer is a correction of a mistake, turning the history of the laboratory into a sacrament of the biological competition, where the son must exceed the mother. The first battle with Elizabeth Green beneath the streets of New York provides the lore of the violent reunion of the lineage. When Mercer confronts Green, she does not see a man, but a new body for her will, representing the invasive sovereignty of the matriarch. Her lore is defined by the command of the biomass. She can call the ground to rise and spew the infection, representing the geological sovereignty of the hive mind. This is the lore of the mother's rejection. It suggests that power is jealous and Green will not share the city, turning the subway system into a vein of the vengeance. This represents the territorial sovereignty of the red light. The lore of the Green duel is the lore of the educational beating. Mercer realizes he is under-evolved compared to the 40 years of the growth. proving that his sovereignty must be fed with the blood of the Blackwatch. The introduction of the hunters, the large, clawed viral creatures, provides the lore of the pack-animal logic of the infection. These beasts, created by Green to hunt the Mercer, represent the tactical sovereignty of the apex predator. Their lore suggests that the virus can design a soldier faster than the humanity can build a tank. This is the lore of the biological industry. It suggests that strength is a cheap resource in the Blacklight economy. This represents the predatory sovereignty of the evolution. The lore of the hunter combat is the lore of the mirror of the beast. You must use the claws to kill the claws, proving that your sovereignty is adaptive. This highlights the savage nature of the outbreak, turning the Times Square battle into a sacrament of the meat, where the hero must prove his rank at the top of the food chain. The lore of the Captain Robert Cross introduces the lore of the human counter-evolution. Cross, a high-ranking Blackwatch specialist who has seen the Mercer's kind before, represents the hardened sovereignty of the veteran. His lore is defined by the hatred of the unnatural. He does not fear the virus. He studies the pattern to find the weakness, representing the tactical sovereignty of the human will. This is the lore of the professional hunter. It suggests that discipline can hold the line against the infinite mutation. This represents the militarized sovereignty of the resistance. The lore of Cross's pursuit is the lore of the electric stun. He uses shock batons and specialized equipment to paralyze the apex, proving that your sovereignty is vulnerable to the intellect. This highlights the asymmetrical nature of the war, turning the street encounters into a sacrament of the survival. The presence of the infected water and the blood tox program introduces the lore of the chemical sovereignty of the scorched earth. Blackwatch begins to poison the very air and water to kill the virus, representing the suicidal sovereignty of the containment. The lore suggests that the government is willing to kill the patient to cure the disease. This is the lore of the toxic desperation. It suggests that safety is worth the genocide. This represents the bureaucratic sovereignty of the Blackwatch. The lore of the blood tox is the lore of the red smoke. It chokes the Mercer and burns the flesh, proving that your sovereignty is respirational. This highlights the poisonous nature of the war, turning the quarantine zones into a sacrament of the asphyxiation, where the monster must hold his breath against the law. For the Mercer of the investigation era, the world is the testing of the historical awareness. You realize that the world is lying. The lore suggests that Alex is the detective of the deletion. You are the only mind that connects the hope to the Manhattan. The city is not a puzzle, it is a scene of the crime that you must analyze with your very blood. This perspective is what makes the consuming of the scientists so vindictive. You are stealing the truth from the lips of the liars. You look at the old photographs of Idaho, knowing that they are the only proof that the Blackwatch has a face of the murderer. The Golden Age is a flashback in the red, and you are the only witness left to execute the history. As this second segment of the history concludes, Mercer stands in the ruins of a Gentek lab, the files burning in his mind. Behind lies the ghost of the Hope, Idaho. Before stands the siege of the Elizabeth Green and the final evolution of the Blacklight. The air is no longer tense with the ignorance, but cold with the certainty of the betrayal. You have seen the prehistoric shadow, the origins of the red light, and the first battle with the mother. The lore of Prototype has shifted from the sovereignty of the apex to the sovereignty of the vengeance. You realize that the world is rotten. You look at the sun setting over the Hudson, knowing that you are finally the judge of the human sin. The Golden Age is a nuclear horizon, and you are the only hand left to tear the truth out of the throat of the Blackwatch. The pursuit of Raymond McMullen and the infiltration of the Gentek inner circle introduces the lore of the architect's cowardice. McMullen, the lead scientist of the Blacklight project, represents the intellectual paternity of the plague. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the controlled evolution. He did not want to benefit humanity. He wanted to play God with a clipboard, representing the bureaucratic sovereignty of the Gentek. For Mercer, This confrontation is the lore of the reclamation of the origin. He finds that McMullen views him not as a man, but as property that escaped the vault. This is the lore of the industrialized ego, where the scientist becomes the sacrament of the hubris. It proves that the Blacklight project was a corporate religion, turning the research facility into an altar of the narcissism, where the god is terrified of his own creation. The revelation of the true nature of the Alex Mercer persona provides the lore of the death of the human host. In a psychological shattering, Mercer discovers that the real Alex Mercer died at Penn Station the moment he broke the vial, representing the existential sovereignty of the virus. The lore suggests that the Alex you play is merely the Blacklight virus that has simulated the memories of the corpse it consumed, representing the mimetic sovereignty of the apex. This is the lore of the sentient infection. It suggests that Mercer is a ghost made of meat. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the prototype. The lore of the Penn Station incident is the lore of the original sin of the flesh. It proves that the hero is actually the outbreak itself, turning the identity into a sacrament of the deception, where the man is nothing but a costume for the plague. The release of the specialist, the supreme hunter's gestation, introduces the lore of the competitive evolution of the Blacklight. When Elizabeth Green infects Mercer with a specialized parasite, it represents the maternal sovereignty of the red light. The lore suggests that the mother is pruning the son to create a perfect successor. This is the lore of the internal coup. It suggests that the virus can fight itself to select the strongest strain. This represents the Darwinian sovereignty of the infection. The lore of the parasite removal is the lore of the birth of the rival. By expelling the infection, Mercer inadvertently allows the supreme hunter to gestate it in the cancer center, proving that his sovereignty is unintentionally prolific. This highlights the cyclical nature of the horror, turning the medical district into a sacrament of the rivalry. The lore of the supreme hunter's genesis provides the lore of the pinnacle of the predatory design. This creature, born from Mercer's own discarded biomass, represents the physical mirror of the protagonist. Its lore is defined by the sovereignty of the improved apex. It suggests that evolution has fixed the weaknesses of the Mercer, representing the genetic sovereignty of the green. This is the lore of the dark twin. It suggests that power is a template that can be optimized. This represents the synthetic sovereignty of the Blacklight. The lore of the supreme hunter is the lore of the shadow of the self. You must kill the version of yourself that is better than you, proving that your sovereignty is stubborn. This highlights the antagonistic nature of the mutation, turning the final lab raid into a sacrament of the sibling rivalry, where the son must destroy the brother. The betrayal of Raymond McMullen and his final choice provides the lore of the suicide of the guilty science. When cornered, McMullen chooses to take his own life rather than be consumed and remembered by Mercer, representing the sovereignty of the final secret. His lore is defined by the fear of the eternal memory. He realizes that death is safety compared to becoming a part of the Mercer's mind, representing the psychological sovereignty of the escape. This is the lore of the information blackout. It suggests that truth can be deleted by the pull of a trigger. This represents the cynical sovereignty of the scientist. The lore of McMullen's end is the lore of the dead end of the investigation. It leaves Mercer hungry for the answers that no longer exist in the flesh, proving that his sovereignty is isolated. The introduction of the thermobaric tank and the strike team elite introduces the lore of the high-heat sovereignty of the military. Blackwatch begins to deploy thermobaric weaponry, specifically designed to incinerate the viral cells on contact, representing the chemical sovereignty of the containment. The lore suggests that fire is the only language the virus understands. This is the lore of the scorched Manhattan. It suggests that the military is willing to melt the city to boil the Mercer. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the Randall. The lore of the elite strike team is the lore of the wall of the flame. It forces the predator to use the stealth, proving that your sovereignty is not heat-resistant. This highlights the technological pressure of the war, turning the Midtown combat into a sacrament of the evaporation. For the Mercer of the identity era, the world is the testing of the existential integrity. You realize that the world is right to fear you. The lore suggests that Alex is the living lie of the Gentek. You are the only monster that thinks it is a man. The city is not a scene, it is a feasting hall that you must cleanse with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the discovery of the corpse so cold. You are not seeking your past. You are seeking the past of a dead stranger. You look at the vial in the memory, knowing that it was the only weapon that the real Alex ever successfully used. The Golden Age is a shattered mirror, and you are the only reflection left to bite the hand of the creator. As this third segment of the history concludes, Mercer stands in the smoking ruins of the Gentek office, the McMullen's blood on the floor. Behind lies the death of the human host. Before stands the arrival of the Supreme Hunter and the nuclear solution of the Blackwatch. The air is no longer tense with the identity, but heavy with the static of the endgame. You have seen the architect's cowardice, the mimetic sovereignty of the apex, and the birth of the rival. The lore of Prototype has shifted from the sovereignty of the vengeance to the sovereignty of the survival. You realize that the mother is calling. You look at the skyline, knowing that you are finally the only king of the waste. The Golden Age is a pulse in the dark, and you are the only will left to consume the future of the species. The descent into the heart of the hive and the final breach of the red zone introduces the lore of the biological cathedral of the damned. This is the realization that the virus has moved from infection to urban reform, representing the architectural sovereignty of the mother. The lore suggests that the hive is not a building, but a pulsing organ of the size of a city block, representing the respiratory sovereignty of the Blacklight. For Mercer, this descent is the lore of the infiltration of the womb. He finds that the walls are living tissue that resonate with the green's heartbeat. This is the lore of the organic conquest, where the steel has been digested to create a sacrament of the biomass. It proves that the Gentek disaster has birthed a new ecosystem, turning the Manhattan Underground into a cradle of the apocalypse, where the humanity is nothing but a nutrient. The second battle with Elizabeth Green provides the lore of the total war of the genetic matriarch. Unlike their first encounter, Green no longer hides in a human skin, but erupts into a colossal pillar of the flesh, representing the gigantic sovereignty of the red light. Her lore is defined by the sovereignty of the planetary hunger. She does not attack, she subsumes, turning the battlefield into a part of her body, representing the territorial sovereignty of the Subject One. This is the lore of the earth-shaking infection. It suggests that green is the final result of the evolution. This represents the primordial sovereignty of the mother. The lore of the green confrontation is the lore of the death of the origin. You must tear the goddess apart to claim the throne, proving that your sovereignty is superior to the source. The emergence of the mother of all infected provides the lore of the biological culmination of the 1960s. This form is the full flowering of what was planted in Hope, Idaho, representing the intergenerational sovereignty of the plague. The lore suggests that green has stored the DNA of 1,000 victims to create this titan, representing the collective sovereignty of the damned. This is the lore of the hive mind ascension. It suggests that individual life is fodder for the goddess. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the virus. The lore of the mother form is the lore of the weight of the ancestry. You are fighting the history of the Blackwatch's sin, proving that your sovereignty is corrective. This highlights the mythic scale of the conflict, turning the ruins of the city into a sacrament of the deicide, where the son must slay the progenitor. The lore of the viral sonar and the tracking of the hive mind provides the lore of the sensory evolution of the predator. To find the heart of the green, Mercer must attune his nervous system to the frequency of the infection, representing the neural sovereignty of the connection. The lore suggests that the virus is a network that hums with the data. This is the lore of the telepathic parasite. It suggests that privacy is impossible in the presence of the Blacklight. This represents the invasive sovereignty of the apex. The lore of the viral pulse is the lore of the echo of the hunger. You hear the city scream through your blood, proving that your sovereignty is empathetic and terrible. This highlights the psychic nature of the outbreak, turning the search for the boss into a sacrament of the synchronization. The introduction of the leader hunters provides the lore of the strategic command of the beast. These specialized creatures, acting as the generals for the green, represent the intellectual sovereignty of the infestation. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the pack leader. They do not just fight, they coordinate the swarm, representing the tactical sovereignty of the mother. This is the lore of the biological officer. It suggests that the virus has learned the military hierarchy from consuming the Blackwatch. This represents the adaptive sovereignty of the combat. The lore of the leader hunter is the lore of the brain of the brawn. You must consume the leader to shatter the swarm, proving that your sovereignty is subversive. This highlights the calculated nature of the war, turning the street skirmishes into a sacrament of the assassination. The presence of the nuclear ultimatum introduces the lore of the final solution of the state. As the green grows out of control, General Randall authorizes the nuclear sanitization of the island, representing the apocalyptic sovereignty of the government. The lore suggests that the Blackwatch would rather erase the New York than let the virus escape, representing the genocidal sovereignty of the containment. This is the lore of the atomic mercy. It suggests that fire is the only way to purify the DNA. This represents the technological sovereignty of the Randall. The lore of the nuclear threat is the lore of the clock of the extinction. It forces the Mercer to hurry his evolution, proving that your sovereignty is time-sensitive. This highlights the nihilistic pressure of the story, turning the final hours into a sacrament of the urgency. For the Mercer of the Hive era, the world is the testing of the generational supremacy. You realize that the world is being replaced. The lore suggests that Alex is the new king of the red soil. You are the only blade that can prune the mother's tree. The hive is not a building, it is a challenge to your existence that you must shred with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the consuming of the green so primal. You are taking the crown from the one who gave you life. You look at the sprawl of the biomass, knowing that it is the only empire that the Blackwatch has left to bomb. The Golden Age is a roar from the depths, and you are the only echo left to silence the mother of the sin. As this fourth segment of the history concludes, Mercer stands over the dissolving remains of the Elizabeth Green, the red light fading into his blacklight. Behind lies the deicide of the hive. Before stands the arrival of the USS Ronald Reagan and the final duel with the specialist. The air is no longer tense with the mother's call, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the metal. You have seen the anatomical sovereignty of the mother, the total war of the matriarch, and the nuclear ultimatum. The lore of Prototype has shifted from the sovereignty of the survival to the sovereignty of the savior. You realize that the city is yours to save or burn. You look at the Atlantic horizon, knowing that you are finally the only shield against the nuclear winter. The Golden Age is a mushroom cloud in the distance, and you are the only will left to carry the bomb into the sea. The infiltration of the USS Ronald Reagan and the final breach of the Blackwatch Naval Command introduces the lore of the sovereign fortress of the military-industrial complex. As the nuclear strike becomes imminent, Mercer realizes that the brain of the operation is no longer in the city, but floating in the harbor, representing the offshore sovereignty of the state. The lore suggests that the aircraft carrier is a steel continent, where the laws of the mainland do not apply. For Mercer, this mission is the lore of the assassination of the authority. He finds that the soldiers are programmed to value the mission over the survival of the species, representing the conditional sovereignty of the duty. This is the lore of the naval purgatory, where the Blacklight must board the machine to settle the debt of the mankind. It proves that the Blackwatch command is the final filter of the sin, turning the flight deck into a sacrament of the mutiny. The final stand of General Randall provides the lore of the fanaticism of the old guard. Randall, the architect of the nuclear solution, represents the unwavering sovereignty of the scorched earth policy. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the greater good. He does not view himself as a villain, but as the last sane man willing to kill 1,000,000 to save 1,000,000,000, representing the cold sovereignty of the utilitarianism. This is the lore of the martyrdom of the tyrant. It suggests that the military mind is as fixed as the genetic code. This represents the bureaucratic sovereignty of the sacrifice. The lore of the Randall's execution is the lore of the silence of the orders. Mercer consumes him not for power, but to stop the countdown, proving that your sovereignty is humanitarian despite your monster's form. This highlights the political horror of the prototype, turning the bridge of the ship into a sacrament of the coup. The betrayal of Captain Cross and the revelation of the stolen identity introduces the lore of the parasitic sabotage of the rank. As Mercer prepares to disarm the bomb, Cross reveals that he is no longer the soldier Mercer fought in the streets, but a vessel for the Supreme Hunter, representing the mimetic sovereignty of the rival. The lore suggests that the specialist was eaten from the inside out weeks ago. This is the lore of the infiltrated sovereignty. It suggests that the virus has learned to play the game of the hierarchy. This represents the strategic sovereignty of the Supreme Hunter. The lore of the Cross reveal is the lore of the end of the human face. It proves that the only thing standing between the Mercer and the peace is his own failed evolution, turning the carrier's flight deck into a sacrament of the mirror, where the savior must kill the saboteur. The lore of the Supreme Hunter's metamorphosis provides the lore of the perfected symmetry of the Blacklight. This creature, having stored the skills of the Cross, represents the physical peak of the viral potential. Its lore is defined by the sovereignty of the Master Mimic. It suggests that the Supreme Hunter is the final answer to the Mercer's question, representing the competitive sovereignty of the infection. This is the lore of the ultimate predatory evolution. It suggests that identity is the best weapon the virus ever invented. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the replacement. The lore of the final duel on the Reagan is the lore of the clash of the apexes. You are fighting the demon you created in a world you destroyed, proving that your sovereignty is redemptive. This highlights the internal conflict of the species, turning the deck of the ship into a sacrament of the fratricide. The lore of the nuclear countdown and the logic of the clock provides the lore of the mathematical pressure of the annihilation. As the bomb's timer ticks toward zero, the lore suggests that the world is measured in the seconds, representing the temporal sovereignty of the physics. This is the lore of the atomic inevitability. It suggests that power is useless if the environment is erased. This represents the elemental sovereignty of the uranium. The lore of the countdown is the lore of the last pulse of the Manhattan. It forces the Mercer to abandon the vengeance and choose the sacrifice, proving that your sovereignty is moral. This highlights the high-stakes nature of the ending, turning the fight against the Supreme Hunter into a sacrament of the final seconds, where the monster must clear the deck to save the city that hates him. The presence of the Blackwatch clean sweep protocol introduces the lore of the final erasure of the witnesses. As the ship prepares for the nuclear event, the orders are to shoot anyone not on the manifest, representing the lethal sovereignty of the secrecy. The lore suggests that Umbrella, or the government, is hungrier than the virus, representing the political sovereignty of the survival. This is the lore of the administrative genocide. It suggests that truth is the first casualty of the bio-war. This represents the cynical sovereignty of the state. The lore of the clean sweep is the lore of the bullet in the dark. It removes the humanity from the soldiers, proving that your sovereignty is the only soul left in the harbor. This highlights the tragic nature of the alliance, turning the infiltration into a sacrament of the disillusionment. For the Mercer of the naval era, the world is the testing of the heroic delusion. You realize that the world is better off without its masters. The lore suggests that Alex is the only guardian of the New York. You are the only hands that carry the sun into the sea. The carrier is not a ship. It is a mechanical heart of the war that you must stop with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the killing of Randall so quiet. You are decapitating the government to give the people a tomorrow. You look at the nuclear device, knowing that it is the only torch that the Blackwatch has left to light the dark. The golden age is a click of the trigger on the deck, and you are the only echo left to shatter the logic of the general. As this fifth segment of the history concludes, Mercer stands on the edge of the USS Ronald Reagan, the nuclear bomb in his grip. Behind lies the betrayal of Captain Cross. Before stands the flight into the Atlantic and the detonation of the final hope. The air is no longer tense with the virus, but electric with the heat of the imminent sun. You have seen the sovereign fortress, the martyrdom of the tyrant, and the parasitic sabotage of the rank. The lore of Prototype has shifted from the sovereignty of the savior to the sovereignty of the sacrifice. You realize that the price of the life is your own death. You look at the Manhattan skyline in the distance, knowing that you are finally the only hero the world will never know. The golden age is a flash in the ocean, and you are the only light left to save the people from the fire. The nuclear detonation over the Atlantic and the subsequent vaporization of the USS Ronald Reagan introduces the lore of the atomic cleansing of the Blacklight. As Mercer pilots the helicopter carrying the bomb into the ocean, the explosion represents the technological sovereignty of the absolute zero. The lore suggests that fire is the only thing that can pause the evolution, representing the thermal sovereignty of the state. For the Mercer entity, this is the lore of the martyrdom of the non-human. He allows himself to be caught in the center of a miniature sun, proving that the virus has developed a moral agency that exceeds the humanity of its creators. This is the lore of the molecular suicide, where the monster becomes the sacrament of the salvation. It proves that the Blackwatch solution succeeded in killing the host, but failed to understand the resilience, turning the Atlantic seaboard into a cradle of the ghost. The regeneration from the crow provides the lore of the indestructible persistence of the biological code. In the aftermath of the blast, a single piece of charred viral biomass remains on the shore, which consumes a passing crow to rebuild itself, representing the opportunistic sovereignty of the life force. The lore suggests that Alex Mercer is no longer a shape, but a digital sequence in the blood that can reboot from a single cell. This is the lore of the avian resurrection. It suggests that death is merely a temporary state of low energy. This represents the genetic sovereignty of the survivor. The lore of the crow's consumption is the lore of the loss of the human anchor. By rebuilding himself from a bird rather than a man, Mercer loses his biological connection to the species, proving that his sovereignty is now post-human. The philosophical shift of the post-nuclear Mercer introduces the lore of the nihilism of the apex predator. As he stands alone in the clean streets of the aftermath, Mercer realizes that he has saved a world that deserves to rot, representing the psychological sovereignty of the disillusionment. The lore suggests that the heroic act was the last gasp of the human memory, and what remains is the pure logic of the virus. This is the lore of the Cold Awakening. It suggests that humanity is a weakness that led to the Blacklight project in the first place. This represents the misanthropic sovereignty of the Blacklight. The lore of the new Mercer is the lore of the end of the empathy. He no longer wants to belong. He wants to lead, proving that his sovereignty is evolutionary and absolute. This highlights the dark transformation of the savior, turning the victory into a sacrament of the contempt. The lore of the pariah and the final secret of the bloodline provides the lore of the binary apocalypse of the infection. Through the final fragments of the web of intrigue, the lore reveals the existence of Pariah, the child of Elizabeth Green who represents a perfected version of the virus, representing the hidden sovereignty of the successor. The lore suggests that while Mercer is the consumer, Pariah is the destination. This is the lore of the prophecy of the two strains. It suggests that the war was just a testing ground for a greater conflict between the mother's children. This represents the eschatological sovereignty of the Blackwatch. The lore of the pariah is the lore of the shadow in the background. It reminds the player that Mercer is just a prototype for a god that has yet to wake up, turning the conclusion into a sacrament of the dread. The presence of the shadow state and the survival of Blackwatch introduces the lore of the institutional immortality of the conspiracy. Despite the destruction of the Reagan and the death of Randall, the organization simply recalibrates and moves underground, representing the bureaucratic sovereignty of the Hydra. The lore suggests that Umbrella, or Blackwatch, is an idea that cannot be killed with a bomb. This is the lore of the endless containment. It suggests that liberty will forever be sacrificed at the altar of the security. This represents the permanent sovereignty of the deep state. The lore of the survival is the lore of the unclosed wound. It forces the Mercer to realize the futility of the war, proving that his sovereignty is tactical but not structural. This highlights the cynical reality of the power, turning the aftermath into a sacrament of the futility. The lore of the Mercerism and the viral religion provides the lore of the cult of the accelerated evolution. In the quiet corners of the ruined city, survivors begin to worship the shapeshifter as a god of the new age, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the infection. The lore suggests that the virus is seductive to the powerless. This is the lore of the gospel of the biomass. It suggests that becoming a part of the Mercer is the only way to survive the future. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the apex. The lore of the viral cult is the lore of the infection of the faith. It prepares the world for the second outbreak, proving that your sovereignty is mimetic. This highlights the invasive nature of the Blacklight, turning the social fabric into a sacrament of the assimilation, where the monster becomes the messiah. For the Mercer of the post-nuclear era, the world is the testing of the infinite loneliness. You realize that the world is yours to shape. The lore suggests that Alex is the only architect of the future. You are the only mind that understands the lie of the civil rights. The city is not a place. It is a drafting table for a new species that you must engineer with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the walking through the crowd so alien. You are not one of them anymore. You look at the people, knowing that they are the only resource that the nature has left to upgrade. The golden age is a silence on the rooftop, and you are the only will left to discard the human mask forever. As this sixth segment of the history concludes, Mercer stands on the gantry of a New York skyscraper, looking down at the ant-like movements of the humanity. Behind lies the martyrdom of the non-human. Before stands the dark evolution of the Prototype 2 and the war against the James Heller. The air is no longer tense with the battle, but cold with the certainty of the supremacy. You have seen the atomic cleansing, the resurrection from the crow, and the philosophical shift. The lore of Prototype has shifted from the sovereignty of the sacrifice to the sovereignty of the overman. You realize that the hero is dead. You look at your hands, knowing that you are finally the final version of the life. The Golden Age is a red sun rising over a viral empire, and you are the only god left to eat the world to save it. The descent into the worldwide outbreak and the transition of the Blacklight entity from city-level containment to global biological imperative introduces the lore of the viral diaspora. After the events in New York, Mercer realizes that the humanity he saved is a failed experiment of the nature, representing the misanthropic sovereignty of the apex. The lore suggests that Mercer traveled the world to find one good reason to let the human race survive, only to find greed, war, and corruption, representing the moral bankruptcy of the species. For the entity now calling itself Mercer, this journey is the lore of the final disillusionment. He decides that the gift of the Blacklight should not be destroyed, but distributed, representing the democratization of the infection. This is the lore of the biological equality, where the Mercer becomes the sacrament of the forced evolution. It proves that the Blacklight virus has outgrown its cage, turning the entire planet into a Gentek lab without walls. The creation of the evolved provides the lore of the strategic proliferation of the sentient plague. Realizing he cannot be everywhere at once, Mercer begins to gift portions of his biomass to specific human subjects, turning them into the evolved, representing the feudal sovereignty of the infection. Unlike the walkers or hunters, These beings retain their intelligence and personalities, but are bound to the Mercer's will, representing the invasive sovereignty of the hive mind. This is the lore of the new nobility. It suggests that sovereignty is now a genetic privilege granted by the father. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the Mercer. The lore of the evolved is the lore of the fifth column. They infiltrate the government and the Blackwatch to prepare the way for the second outbreak, proving that your sovereignty is subversive and global. The final transformation of Alex Mercer into the antagonist provides the lore of the transcendence of the villainy. By the time of the second outbreak in New York 0 NYZ, Mercer has completely discarded his human perspective, representing the absolute sovereignty of the Blacklight. He no longer seeks the truth. He creates the reality, turning the red zone into a temple of his power, representing the theological sovereignty of the apex. This is the lore of the death of the protagonist. It suggests that the Mercer of the first game was just the larval stage of a world-eating god. This represents the predatory sovereignty of the end times. The lore of the villainous Mercer is the lore of the Great Reset. He seeks to consume the world to end the suffering of the choice, proving that your sovereignty is annihilation, turning the Mercer's agenda into a sacrament of the rebirth through the rot. The lore of the three zones of New York 0 introduces the lore of the geopolitical anatomy of the outbreak. The division of the city into the green, yellow, and red zones represents the sociological sovereignty of the quarantine. The lore suggests that the Blackwatch has turned the civilization into a graduated slaughterhouse, representing the administrative sovereignty of the genocide. This is the lore of the tiered damnation. It suggests that safety is a lie sold to the poor in the yellow zone. This represents the bureaucratic sovereignty of the Gentek. The lore of the three zones is the lore of the concentric circles of the hell. You must navigate the tiers to find the source, proving that your sovereignty is mobile and deadly. This highlights the systemic nature of the crisis, turning the urban map into a sacrament of the segregation, where the elite hide in the green while the world burns in the red. The introduction of James Heller and the Mercer's Gambit introduces the lore of the genetic suicide of the creator. Mercer deliberately infects Sergeant James Heller, a man who hates him, representing the experimental sovereignty of the self-destruction. The lore suggests that Mercer is bored with his own perfection and seeks a challenge or a successor, representing the nihilistic sovereignty of the Godhead. This is the lore of the gift of the curse. It suggests that Mercer wants to test the limits of the Blacklight through a vessel of the pure rage. This represents the antagonistic sovereignty of the evolution. The lore of the Heller infection is the lore of the weaponized grief. By giving the enemy the power, Mercer turns the war into a sacrament of the duel, proving that his sovereignty is self-correcting, turning the Heller's blood into a reservoir of the vengeance. The presence of the white light cure provides the lore of the pharmaceutical treachery of the Blackwatch. The deployment of white light, a supposed vaccine that actually accelerates the infection, represents the lethal sovereignty of the corporate deception. The lore suggests that Blackwatch has given up on the humanity and is now actively cultivating the plague for the data, representing the cynical sovereignty of the research. This is the lore of the toxic salvation. It suggests that the cure is the final nail in the coffin. This represents the mercenary sovereignty of the Gentek. The lore of the white light is the lore of the poison hope. It liquefies the civilians to feed the evolved, proving that your sovereignty is the only honest force in a world of the professional liars. This highlights the dreadful reality of the NYZ, turning the medical tents into a sacrament of the betrayal. For the Mercer of the antagonist era, the world is the testing of the final purpose. You realize that the world is yours to harvest. The lore suggests that Alex is the only sane mind in a dying species. You are the only hand that pulls the trigger on the mankind to save the planet. The NYZ is not a city. It is a sacrificial altar that you must light with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the infecting of Heller so clinical. You are playing with the fire to see if it can burn you. You look at the Heller's rage, knowing that it is the only energy that the humanity has left to challenge the Blacklight. The Golden Age is a red tide rising, and you are the only will left to orchestrate the symphony of the mutation. As the seventh segment of the history concludes, Mercer stands at the center of the red zone, the evolved bowing before him. Behind lies the disillusionment of the worldwide outbreak. Before stands the final duel with James Heller and the consuming of the Creator. The air is no longer tense with the identity, but heavy with the smell of the infinite biomass. You have seen the viral diaspora, the creation of the evolved, and the theological sovereignty of the apex. The lore of Prototype has shifted from the sovereignty of the overman to the sovereignty of the antagonist. You realize that the world is ready to be reborn. You look at the Heller approaching, knowing that you are finally the final boss of the human history. The Golden Age is a Blacklight apocalypse, and you are the only god left to teach the world how to die. The final battle on the Gentek rooftop and the ultimate collision between the two apex predators introduces the lore of the biological gutter dameron. This is the moment where the Creator and the creation meet to decide the genetic future of the planet, representing the existential sovereignty of the Blacklight. The lore suggests that the rooftop is not a battlefield, but a pulpit of the evolution. For Mercer, this confrontation is the lore of the testing of the Godhead. He does not fight Heller to win, but to verify if the Heller strain is worthy of inheriting the Earth, representing the nihilistic sovereignty of the Prototype. This is the lore of the final calibration, where the Mercer becomes the sacrament of the ultimate sacrifice. It proves that the Gentek sin ends in a suicide of the species, turning the skyline of New York Zero into a casket of the human form. The consuming of the evolved by Mercer during the duel provides the lore of the absolute consolidation of the biomass. As Mercer absorbs his disciples to fuel his power, it represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the source. The lore suggests that the evolved were never partners, but living batteries stored for the final conflict, representing the parasitic sovereignty of the Father. This is the lore of the unification of the plague. It suggests that sovereignty cannot be shared, only concentrated. This represents the singular sovereignty of the apex. The lore of the consuming is the lore of the end of the hierarchy. It proves that Mercer is the alpha and the omega of the infection, turning the rooftop into a sacrament of the reabsorption, where the children return to the womb of the virus. The final stand of James Heller and the rage-induced evolution provides the lore of the human soul as a biological catalyst. As Heller overcomes the Mercer through pure, unfiltered hatred, it represents the moral sovereignty of the grief. The lore suggests that the Blacklight virus reacts to emotion as much as DNA, representing the sentimental sovereignty of the host. This is the lore of the vengeful successor. It suggests that Mercer failed because he lost his humanity, while Heller succeeded because he used it as a weapon. This represents the humanistic sovereignty of the Prototype too. The lore of Heller's victory is the lore of the death of the architect. You must tear the arms from the god to save the daughter, proving that your sovereignty is paternal, turning the Mercer's death into a sacrament of the passing of the torch. The lore of the Mercer's final words provides the lore of the satisfaction of the monster. As Mercer is consumed, his final utterance, "Welcome to the top of the food chain," represents the vindicated sovereignty of the predator. The lore suggests that Mercer wanted to be eaten, proving that his grand plan was to find someone strong enough to kill him, representing the euthanasia sovereignty of the apex. This is the lore of the successful failure. It suggests that evolution won even if the individual lost. This represents the genetic sovereignty of the Blacklight. The lore of the final consumption is the lore of the fusion of the strains. Heller becomes the ultimate vessel by eating the king, proving that his sovereignty is total and absolute, turning the Heller's body into the final archive of the Mercer. The post-Mercer world and the Blacklight legacy introduces the lore of the silent peace of the virus. With Mercer gone, Heller uses his infinite power to release a pulse that consumes all the infected in the city, representing the redemptive sovereignty of the Purge. The lore suggests that the NYZ is cleansed not by Blackwatch, but by the monster who cared, This is the lore of the benevolent plague. It suggests that the virus can be a force for the life if the heart is pure. This represents the empathic sovereignty of the Heller. The lore of the cleansing is the lore of the end of the Blacklight War. It reminds the survivors that safety was bought with the blood of the prototypes, turning the ruins of the city into a sacrament of the memory. The lore of the Maya Heller and the future of the species provides the lore of the domesticated sovereignty of the superbeing. The survival of Heller's daughter represents the last reason for the Earth to spin, representing the biological sovereignty of the hope. The lore suggests that the Heller will now watch the world from the shadows, acting as a silent guardian against the remaining Gentek secrets, representing the vigilante sovereignty of the apex. This is the lore of the hidden god. It suggests that the world is safe only as long as the Heller is happy. This represents the precarious sovereignty of the peace. The lore of the ending is the lore of the quiet sunset. It proves that the prototype can choose to be a father instead of a god, turning the final horizon into a sacrament of the humanity restored. For the Heller of the final part, the world is the testing of the internal control. You realize that the world is inside you. The lore suggests that Heller is the lid on the Pandora's box. You are the only hand that stops the consumption because you remember the face of your child. The city is not a place. It is a witness to your grief that you must protect with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the consuming of Mercer so exhausting. You are becoming the thing you hated to kill the thing you hated. You look at the streets, knowing that they are quiet because you ate the noise. The Golden Age is a hug in the ruins, and you are the only wall left to keep the darkness from the daughter. As this eighth and final segment of the history concludes, Heller stands on the Gentek rooftop, the morning sun rising over a purified New York. Behind lies the annihilation of the Alex Mercer. Before stands the mystery of the future and the legacy of the Blacklight. The air is no longer tense with the infection, but clear with the finality of the conflict. You have seen the biological Götterdämmerung, the consuming of the evolved, and the redemptive sovereignty of the purge. The lore of Prototype has shifted from the sovereignty of the antagonist to the sovereignty of the father. You realize that the story is over. You look at your hands, knowing that you are finally the only apex predator with a heart. The Golden Age is a silence of the virus, and you are the only man left to watch the world go back to sleep,